welcome to another edition of The Locker Room, where the BS stops and the analysis starts. We are your hosts, Kyle Anderson.
It's Brandon Jones live in the locker room.
Matt Hirsch right here in the locker room.
And The Locker Room is being brought to you by Rammer Jammer Beer, Alabama's light beer. And as always, we're going to talk about the sports. We're going to give you the basic rundown, top analysis. We're not going to BS you, and we're going to do a lot better than the rest of them out there.
That's right.
Now, the big thing that we're going to start off with tonight is college football. Season's over, guys. We just wrapped up recruiting, and we're going to get into that. But we're going to start off talking about the whole season and basically who the big surprises and who the big letdowns were.
Now we're going to cover the sad time and still talk about college football. How many days is it till college football, guys?
What, 220, 218, somewhere around
Too
there?
many.
Yeah.
Too many.
Yeah.
It'll be here before we know it, though. That's for sure.
Right.
So now that the season's over, Alabama basically embarrassed Notre Dame 42-14 in the BCS championship. Looking back on the year, we're going to go ahead and Matt and Brandon are going to kick this off for us. We're going to basically talk about some of the teams that kind of were impressive, but also some of them that were just complete letdowns. I guess we'll start with the first one. Guys, which team starting out just really surprised you this year when the season was over?
Surprising. Well, I was going to say that. Then we're going to leave Alabama out because I think we all kind of knew that was going to happen. Surprising, I would have to say Texas A&M. They really I don't want to say overachieved, but they really surprised a lot of folks as far as everybody thought they'd have an improved year, but not to the level of there were 2 losses on their schedule that they could have easily won and been undefeated.
I would have to go with Texas A&M as a pleasant surprise. Before the season, we thought Jamil Showers was going to be the quarterback. We felt like that defense wouldn't hold up. We saw them make the collapses back in the 2011 season. So Texas A&M was a pleasant surprise, and also Northwestern.
Yes.
Northwestern
finally won a ball game.
Yeah, Northwestern had a pretty good year, and I also have to throw Penn State in there also.
Oh, definitely. Penn State, especially after everything that's happened. And
they had every reason to not have a good year, and they still had a good year. So I have to give O'Brien a lot of credit.
And they signed the number 1 quarterback in the country.
Right.
And also, people were saying that he may have been getting some offers from NFL teams to come coach and other schools, and he basically said, no, I'm going to stay with Penn State. I'm happy where I'm at.
Yeah, I love that guy.
You got to love him. And the other good thing about it, too, is we saw a lot of teams pop up that, kind of surprised everybody. Northwestern, as you were saying, it was announced earlier this week that they will have 5 games at Wrigley Field. People were excited about that, but people like Matt and me remember when they played Illinois and they could only go one way.
Yeah, one way. That was it.
That was strange. Now, they did say that they're going to try to, since they have a little bit more heads up, they're going to try to resolve that. They're not going to, they said with the renovation of Wrigley Field, they can actually take out the dugout cover and extend the field where they can have it the full 120 yards, basically. So that'll be interesting. I know they're doing some great renovations up there. I had a chance this past fall to actually visit up there, and it's a beautiful facility. Not only is it historic, has a lot of storied tradition up there in football and baseball, of course. The Bears played there before Soldier Field in the teens. But it's a great facility, and it's going to be a lot of fun up there.
Now, moving on to the teams that basically were kind of letdowns, I'll go ahead and start with one that I really thought when Brandon talked about them at the beginning of the year, I really thought they were going to have a good showing, and that was the USC Trojans. They just fell apart, and then especially when they got to the Sun Bowl, and you hear all these Twitter account recordings where, we hate this town, and then they show up an hour and a half late to the function, and then here you are playing Georgia Tech, who had to petition the NCAA to basically get in. And I just really was disappointed because they had such high hopes, and they ended the season, 7-6?
Yeah.
Well, we talked about it at the beginning of the season. If you go back and even listen to our podcast from the beginning of the season, that we were afraid that their depth would be an issue. And sure enough, that's exactly what happened. As the year progressed, their depth was an issue. And yeah, sure, their first 22 were very, very good and as good as anybody in the country. But after that, there was such a huge drop-off and I hate to say it for USC, I don't see it getting any better.
USC is definitely one of those disappointing teams. I want to add a team to those pleasant surprises, Ole Miss.
Definitely.
Yes. Hugh Freeze did a lot with not a lot of talent.
Honestly, Lane Kiffin could probably take a page out of the Hugh Freeze book of how to coach, because Ole Miss is another team that didn't have a lot of depth, and their first 22 weren't even that stellar, and he found a way to really produce with what would be more often than not considered a less than mediocre team.
But my disappointing team's going to be Mississippi State.
Yes.
Definitely. They start off 7-0. You go back and you analyze that schedule, and you realize through those first 7 games, you didn't really play anybody. You're a paper champion. So Mississippi State was definitely one. USC was definitely one of those teams. And for my other team, I got to go with out, and I got to say Michigan State. I had a lot of I thought the world of Michigan State preseason. They had Golston, they had LaDavion Bell. They had some pieces from that Citrus Bowl team that beat Georgia. So they had a lot coming back, and they just really just choked this year.
Right. Disappointing teams. I'm not going to pile on. I'm just going to say it. You guys know we're not going to even have to talk about much Auburn, obviously. That was one of those, if you look at a team that was pleasantly, I don't want to say I was pleasantly surprised, but they had a good year, and they ended on a high note, and I think still surprised some people. There was Clemson, and if you remember, beginning of the season, we'd said that Auburn-Clemson game could make or break each one's season very, very early, and that's exactly what happened. Clemson had a very good year, and Auburn didn't, and it started with that game. That's about all I'm going to say about that. Auburn folks that are listening, I'm not piling on. I'm sorry. It happened. Y'all do better next year. I'm pretty sure about that with Coach Malzahn.
I mean, if you want to say something about Auburn, say something about them. I doubt one of them say something to you.
Yeah. Well, no, it's okay. Some other teams that I was disappointed with, I'm not going to say teams that were just lost a lot, but I was disappointed you were talking about Michigan State. I was disappointed in Michigan. They still had a very, very good year. Don't get me wrong. But they were very much exposed in a lot of their games, especially with Denard Robinson at the helm. Alabama, showed who they were. Notre Dame showed who they were. And they had some trouble in some really key rivalry-type games that they didn't win, and you got to win at least one or two of those rivalry games.
I will say probably another team you could throw in there, and both Matt and Brandon, you both guys hinted at this at the beginning of the year, and I kind of was a little skeptical, but you were right, was Virginia Tech.
Yes.
I thought Virginia Tech would reel off those 9 wins like they always do and get to a good bowl game, and they barely got into the bowl game. They won, but how much of that really is, like you guys said, has to do with the coach at Virginia and the recruiting he's doing. Because what was it in recruiting? They're talking about Virginia Tech's recruiting class was not good this year.
That's another one. Virginia disappointed me because I thought they were going to do a lot better, and they didn't. But here's the other thing. You want to talk about a big surprise. The ACC as a whole. They weren't by any means the best conference, but they were probably the most improved conference. It was tough for Virginia Tech because they had to play in the ACC with the Clemsons and Florida States of the world that were better. Clemson didn't want to get embarrassed like they were versus West Virginia. Clemson, talking about teams that were disappointing, LSU, they had a really good year too, but that way they lost to Clemson. It's one of those, that's the last taste we're going to get out of LSU for the year. That leaves a lot to be desired if you really want to watch LSU.
And I can actually add one to that, Utah. A lot of people felt like Utah was going to be that sleeper team. They had a lot coming back. Dominant defensive tackle, experienced quarterback.
Right.
And they started off strong. It looked like that Utah was going to be a team. They hyped that Utah-USC Thursday night game up. And from that point on, it was downhill for Utah.
I think that something that's really interesting that we've been talking about is teams that they started strong and they fell off down the stretch when it really mattered, because We've talked about Utah. We've talked about Mississippi State. Another team, and I've already kind of mentioned it, but another one, West Virginia.
Yes.
West Virginia start off looking like they're going to have a Heisman Trophy winner and compete for a national championship, and then they actually finally played a team with a defense.
I think West Virginia is about to find out. We talk about Rich Rodriguez when he was at West Virginia, but if you look at those Rich Rodriguez teams, his defenses were always ranked in the top 15.
Right.
He won it with defense. Prior to Pat White and Steve Slayton and those guys getting there, it was a defense that carried West Virginia through. Dana Holgorsen, you're going to have to sign some defensive players. You're going to have to play some defense if you want your team to be successful. Because that high-powered offense, it ain't going to be clicking week in, week out. It's going to come down to a point where you're going to have to stop someone. So,
well, and we've talked about it before on and off air. But the thing is, with those kind of spread offenses or really fast-paced, offenses that revolve around having a no huddle, those are great until you go 3 and out, and then those 3 and outs start happening quicker and quicker and quicker, and your defense just gets beat. So
Definitely.
if you're going to run that, you better have a good, well-conditioned defense.
And what's so funny is Texas, I know people will say, yeah, Texas got to a bowl game and they beat Oregon State. Yes, they did. However, this is the second year in a row that they haven't just lost to Oklahoma. They have gotten destroyed.
Texas has been disappointing since they lost that Rose Bowl to Alabama. From 2010 to now, they've been disappointing.
Now, transitioning into the recruiting, it just wrapped up a couple days ago.
They've been disappointing in recruiting.
Yeah. They said this is the first year that a 5-star athlete in the state of Texas did not go to any of the Texas schools. None of them. They all went somewhere else. But what's amazing is A&M was getting a majority of the Texas talent in the state. Texas, they're saying this is not one of their best recruiting classes. USC had not a very good year. In the last couple of years, they've been near the top. And like Brandon said, Ole Miss, which he put on his Twitter account, you need to check this out, Ole Miss has proven that they're going to start running with the big boys. Mm-hmm. They came out of nowhere with their recruiting class. What was the most surprising person they got, Brandon? Which one do you think jumps out at you that I can't believe they got them?
For me, it wasn't Kim Dichie because Denzel Kim Dichie is already there. I would have to go with the receiver out of Illinois, number 1 receiver in the country. Him and Devontae Kincaid. I've been watching Devontae Kincaid for a little over a year. He's from Skyline out in Dallas. This kid is one of those Heisman Trophy type game-breaking quarterbacks, and you had Texas A&M on him, Texas on him, and you kind of think, how does this 4-star Elite 11 quarterback leave the state of Texas to go to Ole Miss? That was a big surprise for me.
With Ole Miss, I don't want to say that. I don't want to pick one person that was a surprise. I think I agree with you. Kim Dichie was kind of a given with his brother. It was looking more and more sure, especially as the weeks and months progressed. But I think just their overall talent level they got, almost the consistency of their talent level, that they didn't get 1 5-star and the rest mediocre talent. They've got a full class of very talented student athletes. Where you would see something like that in the past from an Ole Miss or a middle of the road at best team in the SEC that would get a 5-star and make a lot of noise with that, and then the rest of their recruiting class was kind of it was a snooze fest. Nothing really that was impressive. Their entire recruiting class could play at anywhere.
They're solid.
And what's amazing, somebody brought this up, and I thought it was a great point, or it's a good question for you guys. When you look at Ole Miss and you look at Mississippi State, someone made the comment that when we watched them play in the Egg Bowl this year, those were 2 ships passing in the night. One's going one way and the other one's going the other. Do you guys see it that way? Do you see it almost like Ole Miss is starting to go to the front and Mississippi State's starting to slip?
Yes.
It's certainly starting to look that way, doesn't it?
It makes me wonder if Dan Mullen should have gotten out while the getting was good. I know he's been flirting with some other places. The grass always kind of looks greener. I wonder if he's outstayed his welcome at Mississippi State, because he doesn't dominate that state anymore by any means.
Did you see, if you look at the classes in comparison, you put them up next to each other, Hugh Freeze took Dan Mullen, out to the woodshed.
Right.
And he's still back there with him. Because Hugh Freeze has already started on the class of 2014. Dan Mullen, I told people this a while back. When his name was popping up for these jobs, I would always say, who has Dan Mullen beaten? All right, he's beaten who he's supposed to beat, and he's gotten his eyes beat out by the people who's supposed to beat his eyes out. Okay? So, and what's happening is Ole Miss is taking that step forward. Okay? They beat him in the Egg Bowl. You see the turnout they had at the Compass Bowl here in Birmingham.
Right.
I actually was in the crowd for that.
I was in that crowd. The momentum is going. Ole Miss right now is buzzing. And when you're in the state of Mississippi, you're already at a disadvantage, okay? Because of the educational system, a lot of those kids can't qualify. Hugh Freeze is taking his recruiting almost national, which was something Ole Miss has never really been able to do.
And Ole Miss has such a negative persona just because of their mascot and their history as well.
Yeah.
With them being the rebels, and they used to have Confederate flags that they used to wave them around and everything. And Colonel Reb walking out there. It's definitely, had a
very negative
really negative impact on a lot of student athletes.
Now, when we look at the top classes in recruiting, Alabama's number one. This is the 6th year in a row they've had a top 3 recruiting class.
And just to stop our listening audience before you go, well, what service are you using? Alabama was a consensus number 1.
So that was Scout.com, that was
ESPN,
Rivals, ESPN. Now, Ohio State coming in at 2, Urban Meyer doing a great job up there with recruiting. One of the things I think that's really the question I want to ask you guys is, looking at the recruiting, I know we're way out from next year, but looking at the recruiting, which programs in there from their recruiting classes that you can tell that, hey, they're going to make some noise next year, and they may not win it all, but they're definitely going to be vastly improved from where they were this year?
I don't know how much improved you could be from 12-0, but The Ohio State University.
It was interesting to hear with Ohio State, and just one of the star recruits that they got that was pursued nationally by a lot of different teams. I believe his receiver, Von Bell. He said, well...
From Tennessee.
Right. And he was looking at Tennessee and Alabama and a couple of Florida schools, if I remember right. He said, I want to go to Ohio State so I can beat Alabama at national championships. That was what he said. Yeah. I guess that's what Urban Meyer's trying to sell kids on, and it worked. Because, he's really selling kids on, hey, we're going to bring Ohio State and the Big Ten back to national prominence, and you can be part of this. And that's really a good selling point. So,
and it's interesting to see him in 1 year undefeated. Now they're going to be off probation. They can get in there. Now the question comes in, now that the pressure's getting turned up, how do they respond? I know people will say they went 12-0 last year. Yeah, but there really wasn't any pressure. I mean, you weren't going anywhere at the end of the year anyway. You wouldn't have to worry about the pressure of, you're ranked number 1 and you're playing this team and the whole world's watching. Are you going to crack under the pressure? And do you guys see that's going to play any factors this year, or do you think, nope, you still think they'll go undefeated?
When you have your team focused to play, they're focused. And that's one thing about Urban Meyer. He had those guys focused, tuned in to play, and I think he's just going to do the same thing this upcoming year.
Well, here's interesting. You talk about focus. What are you focused on? Who are you focused on? Ohio State's focused on, a national championship, and Alabama. When you do that, you got to be careful because there's always going to be a couple of teams that are focused on solely you. One of those, Michigan, really wants to probably beat Ohio State, and if it's to ruin their hopes, that the big game, that's going to be a good game.
Well, guys, I think y'all have made the perfect point that everybody's going to be watching Ohio State, and I agree with you and Matt. I think it's just going to be an awesome year, and it's going to take too long to get there. Join us, come back with us, because we're going to start covering the NFL and college basketball in the locker room.